Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Dotson. I am your host for Poetry Today and also the founder and program coordinator for Highland Park Poetry. I'm very excited to have as my guest Faisal Mohiuddin. He is the author of the chapbook The Riddle of Longing, which came out in 2017 from Backbone Press. And he has a forthcoming full-length poetry collection, The Displaced Children of Displaced Children, which will be published by iWare Publishing this year in 2018, and was selected by Kamiko Hahn as the winner of the 2017 Sexton Prize in Poetry. Big prize, important prize. Excellent prize. Okay. Faisal is also an alumnus of the U.S. Department of State's Teachers for Global Classrooms program, an educator advisor to Narrative 4, and many people in town may know him as Mr. Mohiuddin because he teaches English at Highland Park High School here in Highland Park. People can read all about him and his poetry at his website, which is www.faisalmohiuddin.com. And so you'll get a taste today. You'll get more on the website. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. So,
I'm
as
excited
you can tell,
too.
yeah.
Well, you have had a very exciting year.
Yes.
In 2017,
yes.
it's just like an explosion of activity. Of course, it did start with Highland
I
Park
was going to
Poetry.
say yes. So exactly a year ago, almost a year ago, January 28th it was actually my first ever experience as a featured, like the sole featured reader at any poetry thing. I've done readings for many years, but to be like the showcase poet, and then everything has gone greatly since then. So thank you for having me last year. I'm excited to be back there next month. No, it's been great. I mean, the book is coming out, the chapbook is out, and I feel like I feel more and more part of kind of the poetry community in the larger world, and so thank you for bringing me in a year ago.
Well, we're excited that you're going to be coming back to our event at Madame Zuzu's to read more poems, new poems, all kinds of good stuff. That would be great.
Thank you.
And it's also exciting that you have this identity as a poet, which is taken off in a big way, and then you also are a teacher. How do you juggle and do these two things? Help each other, get in the way of each other?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I think for me, I love teaching, and so for me it's like I don't really need to think about how am I going to make time for teaching. That happens. It's a lot of work. I mean, there's a lot, the planning, the grading, all the meetings during the day, all the emails that come in. But I've also done a lot of fiction writing. Fiction is very hard to do working full time, and so poetry, I can find that 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. I live in the city, so I take the train up and down, and to be able to write on the train has been a huge, huge gift the past 5 years. And so, and in the summer when I'm not teaching, I feel less productive as a writer because I don't have that same urgency. I think during the school year, it's like I have these little windows of time, deadlines. I have all these things to do at school. Students waiting always longer than they want to be for papers to get back. But I think it all has fed into each other. One feeds into the other. I teach a lot of poetry, and so as I'm studying it and teaching it and talking to students about it, it's giving me ideas for my own writing. So I think I don't think I would be as successful as a poet if I wasn't a teacher, and I think that the writing has made me a better teacher as well.
Well, I think it's just great that you're also a poet who is also teaching poetry, because then, I mean, so many people have had that terrible experience in high school, English, which turned them off of poetry
yeah,
for the
yeah.
rest of their lives, and they're like, no, not poetry. And so you're like the ambassador to welcome them to this
Yes.
new world.
But I feel like I'm carrying on the mission that my high school English teachers were
Okay.
so good at picking the right poems that would engage us, and we did a lot of creative writing.
Okay.
And I never wrote until, I started writing as a sophomore, in high school,
Okay.
very casually. Just I had this little journal, and it was an extra credit thing that one of my teachers had given us, and said if you just write in your journal twice a week for this quarter, we'll give you I'll give you this many. And I was like, okay, that's a nice bonus.
A nice incentive.
And it just took off from there, like little. And then by the time I was a junior, I said, this is really fun. It's really important. And they were really supportive. And I think what happened in the classroom in high school was really good to help me continue writing and feel excited about it versus feeling intimidated or even detached from poetry. Mm-hmm. And so I think when I'm bringing poems into class, I try to find poems that are going to be interesting to students and aren't so difficult that the first impulse is to kind of lean back, but they're interesting enough that the first impulse
Let's
is to
start
lean in.
with Keats.
Yes.
No,
And then
no.
having students write their own and talk about,
Yeah.
well, why did you write it this way, and talk about the crafting. And then
Sure.
when we read if we read Keats, for example,
Yeah.
by then they'll be able to think, okay, well, let's look at the structure, let's look at the language, let's look at the imagery.
Yeah.
And they've had those conversations about their own work already. And I sometimes will bring in my own work and say, here's a rough draft, and here's a second draft, and here's a 15th draft.
Okay.
And talk a little bit
Interesting.
about
That
the process.
Yeah.
So I think that has also made, I think, the experience for students more, I hope, interesting and,
Yeah.
and
Well,
engaging.
and the students that do come to our events, they always like, wow.
Yeah, well, that's
about
nice.
you.
That's nice.
You have a
That's
fan
very
club.
Nice. Yeah, that's very
You
nice.
have definitely
yes.
a fan club.
So much support at Highland Park at the high school.
Oh,
and
good.
So my colleagues are awesome. Everybody who's there has been nothing but supportive, and that makes it easier too
Yeah.
to not feel like I have to do this as something separate or on the side, but it's a part of my day-to-day life as a teacher as well as a person.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think that's excellent.
So,
Well,
yeah.
but I was also curious about this Department of State's Teachers for Global Classrooms program. What was that?
Sure. So it's a program through the Department of State and also the International Research and Exchange Commission. And what they do is they try to get teachers to be more global in their practice and think about how can the whole world be a part of our classroom.
Oh.
So it's a fellowship. One of my friends from college had done it, and she sent me an email after she studied it for a year. She studied in Colombia in South America as part of her fellowship.
Okay.
And wrote me an email and said, this is probably the greatest thing I've ever done. You have to apply. And so I applied. She was really helpful in the application, just a dozen essays and all these goals and mission statements and what do you want to do and what have you done. And I was really fortunate that in 2014 I got the fellowship. And so it's a one semester online course on how to globalize education. So you do a lot of work on studying what is global education, what are the competencies, and how do you prepare students to be more global citizens. And then there's a big symposium in Washington, D.C., where all the teachers from around the country come in with academics and your advisors. And then at some point you find out that you're going to be sent to a place around the world for your international field experience. So mine was in Senegal about a year and a half ago in April. So I went for a little bit over 2 weeks during the school year, which was pretty amazing.
Okay.
The school was really supportive, and I was able to take my students, some of the work that they had done with me, and bring work back and connect students together. And so that's been really great for me too, to think about just whatever I do and whatever anyone does, but think about the larger world with that. So that's what it is. And then once the fellowship is over, you become an alumni of the fellowship.
Okay.
of the
So
TGC.
then you're training other teachers?
Then you're working with
or-
other teachers. I mean, I've
Okay.
done an online webinar where I'll talk about my experiences and help teachers design their own global experiences, or you become an ambassador for the program, or you just try to integrate more of a global perspective in whatever you're doing. So that's So
That's very cool.
It was very cool. It is like
Yeah.
my friend said, one of the coolest things I've ever done.
Okay.
And then Senegal was amazing. I mean, to have been there and have worked there it was only a couple of weeks, but it felt as if I had been there
Now
for months.
so they speak French and
Yeah,
then
French is
what?
the kind of the official language, and
Okay.
Wolof
Wolof,
was the
okay.
language in the where I was, and my host teacher there was a teacher of English
Okay.
who had actually spent some time on a similar fellowship in the U.S. And so I don't know any French, and I learned a little bit of Wolof, just
Okay.
hello, how are you, thank you,
Okay.
and that was. But most of the people I interacted with either spoke English or Mustafa, who was my
Was with you to
host. He was
translate.
translating
Okay.
a lot,
Okay.
and he was one of my favorite people I've ever met.
Oh,
So
neat.
that
Well,
in
worked
itself,
out really well,
that in
so
itself was a great.
not just a teaching experience, but new friends.
New friends, yes. And then
Yeah.
my co-teacher who went with me is his name is Frank, and he's from Spokane, Washington, and so we did the
Okay,
entire
so
thing.
it was usually a pair going to
There were 14 of us that
Oh, okay.
went, and we spent a week together in Dakar, and then the second week we got sent to
Oh, okay.
like
Your
locations.
individual classroom.
Yes,
or-
yeah,
okay.
the school, and then
Cool.
Frank and I were hosted by Mustafa, and
Wow.
it was amazing. He was amazing.
Oh,
Yeah.
neat. Oh, well, I'm so glad I asked you
Yeah,
about that.
thank
And then,
you.
I was also, I didn't see it in your bio, but I know that you're involved also with Rhino.
I am, yes, yes.
So are you an editor, or are you a,
No,
you're a fellow? What's the?
Neither. It's a Rhino. It's a journal that they've published my poems in the past, and
Okay.
then I led a workshop, a Rhino Reads workshop for them a
okay.
few years back.
All right.
On the poet Rumi and kind of what Rumi's poetry was like. And so, but I love Rhino. I mean, everybody
Yeah.
there has been really, really good to me. And I lived in Evanston for many years, and so
Okay.
having that connection.
So it feels like
and
the hometown journal.
it does.
Yeah.
It does. And
Okay.
so and as you know, I mean, I think you've had
I have
people
had no
connected.
poems, but I've had lots of people
interactions
who are,
with, yes.
their guests have. I mean, they have been my guests here on the show.
Yeah, and they're all great.
And they're
Yeah,
wonderful.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
fabulous people.
Yes. And then in September, I was a featured reader for their monthly reading series
Oh, at that
as well.
was at the coffee shop in.
It was actually at the bookstore.
Oh, okay.
Bookends and Beginnings. Maybe I have the name, but it used to be Bookman's Alley. So I think it's
Oh,
Bookends
okay.
and Book and Beginnings, which I think that whole plaza is
Okay.
about to go
Oh,
under the
dear.
knife. So unfortunately,
Well, we should hear some poetry.
Sure,
So
sure.
do you have? So did you want your book, or you want to read?
you know,
one of yours?
I'll
Okay.
read. Speaking of Rhino, maybe I can start with a poem. And so, one of the things that I really like to do is write poems for people, and I love the acrostic form. And but when I write acrostics, I don't want them to be seen as acrostics. It's
Okay.
almost like a surprise form, and so they're very challenging to write sometimes to disguise the acrostic. So this is a poem called "The Faces of the Holy," and I wrote it as a tribute to Helen Deegan Cohn, who was one of the founding editors of Rhino, and she lived in Deerfield, and then she and I used to meet, for coffee in downtown Highland Park for many years, and she was the one who invited me to give the talk on
Okay.
Rumi.
Yeah.
And that was the last time I saw her. And then about
Oh.
a month later, she had passed away. And I love her poetry. I mean, she's really, really incredible and really good friend. And I realized that I wanted to do something to honor that friendship and honor her and the life. I mean, she was a Holocaust survivor. Her parents, she lost her sister in the genocide and had resettled and started over as a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old in Chicago. And I would think a lot of my own grandparents that I didn't know very well, and my parents, and so it was. I felt like I had a grandmother who was also this poet that
okay.
I loved,
Yeah.
and so this is called "The Faces of the Holy," and the epigraph comes from one of Helen's poems called "The Faces Up There," and it's a tribute to her parents, as after they had passed, and the epigraph goes, "For heaven loves the struggle and the brave faces of fiction. And no one will look upon the holy, for the face of the holy is ashes and smoke." So the faces of the holy. How can the human heart, without ripping apart at the seams, ever house the immeasurable heartache of one's own history? Every life carries a library of loss, dark corridors lined with the never-ending almanacs of tragedy, yes. But where are the ones whose holy nature compels them to sing of the ashes and smoke, to render destruction into something worth remembering, perhaps even beautiful when held against the fire? They walk amongst us, guided by the voices of the dead, collecting windswept scraps of grief, exhuming from the silences the skeletal remains of ancestors whose names must be invented, reanimated by language. And as poets, communing every night with the angels of history, heaven opens its gates for them, gives each a turn to peek inside, to touch hands with the lost, to hear the unutterable prayers of the living echoing through their own yearning, even in death. This is what we now know is holiness, to heal the unhealable anguish of others. And it's the acrostic spells out Helen Deegan Cohn, and so it was something I again didn't want it to be seen that way, but it's definitely her spirit is guiding its way through the whole poem.
Wow, I
So
love
that's
that library of loss. That
Yes,
was a
yes.
really wow image. Yeah, very cool.
I've thought a lot about just how much we don't know of other people's lives, and you know how they've shelved these experiences in their own memory, and sometimes they collect us. Sometimes those books get taken out and you read them, or they're shared, or most of them never at all.
Yeah.
They're just sitting there. So that actually comes up in another poem I'd written too, with the idea of the library of the eternal.
Oh wow, okay.
So.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, she
Thank
should.
you.
She's smiling wherever she is.
Yes, and I miss her very much, and so
Yes,
and I've said that to
yeah.
many people many
Yeah.
times, and so.
Wow. Well, did you want to read a poem from your book?
I would
at
love to,
all?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
I'm gonna reach in your hand.
So I'll read the opening poem, and so the opening poem is called "Ghazal for the Diaspora," and it's the second poem in the full-length collection, and the title of the full-length collection comes from the first line of this poem. So it's
okay, I see. So,
so the chapbook is in some ways like a preview for the full-length,
okay.
and it's a ghazal, so it's couplets, and then the last word of each couplet is the same, and so
Okay.
there's an echoing word here, and it's ghazal for the diaspora. We have always been the displaced children of displaced children, tethered by distant rivers to abandoned lands, our blood's history lost. To temper the grief, imagine your father's last breath as a Mughal garden, with a marble pool at its center, the mirrored sky holding all his tribe had lost. Above the tussle of his wounded city, sad-eyed paper kites fight to stay aloft. One lucky child will be crowned the winner. Everyone else will have lost. Wish peace upon every stranger who arrives at your door, even the thief. For you never know when your last chance at redemption will be lost. In another version of the story, loneliness mothers away the rust. Yet without windows in its hull, the time traveler's supplication gets lost. Against flame-lipped testimonies of homesickness, the swinging of an axe. Felled banyan trees populate your nightmares, new enlightenments lost. The rim of this porcelain cup is chipped, so sip with practiced caution. Even a trace of blood will copper the flavor, the respite of tea now lost. Tell me, Faisal, with what new surrender can you evade even deeper damnation? Whatever it is, hack away before your children too become the lost. So.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I like the fact that that has become then the title of your full-length collection.
Yes.
And so what was the span of the poems well, I guess in this book, the chapbook,
Sure.
and then
And most of the poems are written in the past couple of years.
Okay.
And there's some that maybe the last 5 years. The oldest poem, the full length, is actually a very long, one of the longest poems.
Okay.
That one I wrote the first draft. I remember April of 2000 when I was a
Oh,
senior
wow.
in college, and I worked on it for years.
Okay.
It's called Oyodhya, and it's about this huge massacre, religious kind of massacre that happened in India, in around this mosque that was, there's controversy over, was it built on a sacred Hindu site?
Oh, okay.
And there's so much narrative about what happened, what life was like before that day, and what life has been like after that day. And I wrote it from a Hindu person's point of view, speaking to a Muslim friend of his who's been lost since then. And it's longing for that friendship they had
Yeah.
as boys to reconnect. But he knows it may never happen. And so that poem's from 2000, and it was one of my first actually published poems. It was published about 6 years after that.
Okay.
But most of them, I feel the last few years, and at some point, 2 summers ago, I took everything that I'd written, I read through it, and I started picking the pieces I felt were strong, or strong enough to kind of get close to a stronger place to fit in a collection. And I put a first draft of a collection together. And I remember it was just the title of each poem was like on a little slip of paper. I had these slips on the floor, and I was moving them around, trying to figure out what would the arrangement be, and
Yeah.
how would they be organized in sections. And then I started realizing there were many, many gaps in one example. I write a lot about my parents and their childhood, or my imagined sense of their childhood. And I realized I had written a lot of poems inspired by my dad, but not so many about my mom. And so I said, I'm going to write some poems about my mom. And my mom is from a city called Faisalabad, which is, actually, I'm named
Okay.
after it was a king of Saudi Arabia who was assassinated in the late 70s. And so as a tribute to him, a city called Lyalpur in Pakistan had renamed the city after the king.
Wow. Okay.
And I'm also named after that king, and a lot of boys my age are named Faisal for that same reason. And I went on. My dad's from a city called Lahore. It's kind of the cultural capital of Pakistan, and there's so much literature, and movies, and music and art about Lahore. And I looked at Faisalabad. It's the third largest city in the country,
Okay.
and I could find no poems about it in English and Urdu. I looked. I
wow.
didn't do an exhaustive search in
Yeah.
terms of reaching out to scholars. But I said, if I want to know more about that city from
Yeah.
a literary, artistic perspective, there's nothing there.
Right.
And so that summer I said, I'm going to write a poem called Faisalabad. And
Okay.
I did. It's 5 pages long, very, very
Wow,
big.
okay.
Basically, there's a really famous singer from that city. And so the poem revolves around the singer, my mom's childhood, my naming, my renaming, and also the assassination of the king. This kind of meandering, strange poem about history and names, and how legends kind of become part of a city's identity, but also a person's
Okay.
identity. And so that's actually in the chapbook as well.
And the chapbook, but it's also in the collection.
It'll be the full length as well.
And you were
so-
talking the whole exercise with the strips of paper. That was
Yeah.
for the full length.
That
or
was for the full length.
Okay.
And so what happened with when I had the full length, I realized early on that it wasn't done yet, but I had
Mm-hmm.
the basic structure of a full length. And the original iteration of it was in 5 sections, and my family's from the Punjab state of Pakistan, and Punjab means the land of 5 rivers.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's 5 sections. The title would be great as the land of 5 rivers, and I started thinking about rivers as a guiding theme. And so I wrote in that vein for a little bit, and then I realized that I was forcing it into a sense of a theme of 5, when
Oh,
that really
okay.
wasn't. Culturally, it made sense, but not in terms of 5s. And so I took away the section breaks,
That
and I started,
framework.
and I said, which poems really belong. And once I did that, a lot of poems came out, because
Oh,
in
wow.
that section, I said, well, there's 3 poems here. I need to put more in this section.
Okay.
And so I pulled poems that really didn't fit thematically, or they weren't as strong. And so the slips of paper on the floor was nice, because I could literally step away and look down, and then get down and look at the titles, and then read the poems I'd printed them all out, and almost like feel my way through. And then at some point, a new arrangement took place, and then I still knew that there were more poems to write. And this poem that I wrote about for Helen, and then there's a poem called Denaturalization that I wrote over the summer, were written after I'd already had the full length accepted
Oh, wow.
for
okay.
publication. But I talked to the editors and I said, there's these two poems
please put these in.
that I really feel need to
Yeah.
be in there, and they agreed to let them come in.
Oh, that's great.
And so
When is it? When is the full length
It'll-
expected to be
in
published?
March of
Okay.
2018. So a few months. I sent in
Fabulous.
on 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks. I sent in the most up to date version of it. So I've been revising poems more than writing new poems these past few months. And so the chapbook was: are there certain poems? Is there, within the bigger overarching theme, is there a more narrow theme that I can pull out? And I knew in terms of publishing opportunities that there's more opportunities for chapbooks
Yeah.
to be published in
Sure.
full length. And so,
Yeah,
and the
it's
advice
harder.
I'd gotten from other writers was try for both
Yeah.
and see,
That was very wise.
it was
very
wise. So,
wise.
and the news, I got the acceptance for the chapbook and then the full length about 2 weeks apart.
Oh
which
my
was,
gosh.
Which was really, really, it was hard to believe.
What?
Yeah, I could not believe it. And so,
Wow.
part of, then it became trying to distinguish the titles. I had different titles for the chapbook and the full length, and then
Okay.
once I realized that the full length was more about displacement, the chapbook is more about longing, and so then the titles kind of happened in terms of where each one would go. A little tricky at times,
Sure.
but
yeah.
and I love titles, and it's hard
Yeah.
sometimes to say, okay, this is it, like this is going to be
Yeah.
the title. And
Now, you mentioned also that the cover art is by a friend of yours?
yeah, two friends of mine. So I actually do a lot of visual art as well.
Okay.
And so there's two artists, both Chicago area artists. So Zephyr Mullick is one, and he lives in Wilmette, but he has a studio in Evanston at the Noise Art Center. And the other artist is Sadia O'Kaley. And both are really, really accomplished, amazing artists, and both part of the Pakistani American art community in Chicago. And my first meeting with them was they reached out to me. They were doing an event at the Chicago Cultural Center. Lahore is a sister city of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And both are on the committee. Sadia was very big on the committee for that. And they said, we have visual art, we have film, we don't have any writers. Would you be willing to read? We saw your name.
Okay.
And I said, I would love to. And then I got to know them, me as the writer, they as the visual artist. And then
Yeah.
at one point I went to Zephyr. I lived in Evanston at the time, and I said, I do visual art as well. And I took some of my drawings, and he really liked my drawings.
Oh,
and
neat.
so the first time I ever did like a really serious art show of my own work, it was with the two of them. And they've been so good to me in terms of like supporting me and guiding me. And if I have questions about art or the community or whatever, I can go to them and say, can you give me some wisdom? And
So the publisher had no problem with your
they
using...
didn't, and so
Okay.
I'm not sure what the cover is going to be like for the full length. But with the
Okay.
chapbook, I had asked. They actually sent an email to me and said, be thinking about cover art. And I knew
okay.
before even that email. I said even before this was accepted, I said I would love for Zephyr and Sadia to be involved in the chapbook or the book in some way. And they about 3 years ago in Lake Forest, they did a show of collaborative paintings, like so that they worked together on the same canvas.
Oh,
And
neat.
they both have very different styles, but I went to that show and I was blown away. And so they did another show after that. So this painting is
So they both are the two artists.
two artists, one canvas.
One canvas,
And so
okay.
this is one of my all-time favorite paintings
Yeah.
of theirs. And it was made for a fundraiser, a foundation called the Sonia Shah Foundation. And the woman who runs that, it's in honor of her daughter who actually died in Pakistan doing relief work out there for education. And so I knew that the piece was out of my price range, and it was already kind of claimed by the mom.
Okay.
And so a part of me just like, I would love to have that piece in some capacity, and then they agreed to let me use it as a cover.
Yeah, that's
Iram,
beautiful.
who runs the foundation, was like, that would be awesome for it to be on the cover. And so I feel even more special about this because they're a part of this as well.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of,
Oh,
out
okay,
of
yeah.
time. So, but it's wonderful to have
Sure.
you on the show. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
It went so fast. I mean,
It did.
yeah,
I know.
yeah,
Where did the
yeah.
time go?
I
So-
could talk forever about this, but thank you so much.
I
Thank you
know.
so much. And
Yes,
I,
and thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
we look forward to seeing your full-length
Thank you.
collection. That's
Thank
going to be exciting too. No matter what the cover, even though you don't have any